Beginning years of Richard Pryor's life, the dynamics of his imagination. Gertrude Pryor versus Leroy Pryor. This records sketch the trajectory of the device case of Pryor's parents and suggests the dramatic circumstances around Gertrude's decision to file for divorce 3 years after they were married and 5 years after Richard was born. His mother, Gertrude, took Richard away from the red light district of Peoria and fled with him to her hometown of Springfield, Illinois. According to the court papers, she did not notify the Pryors where she had gone, and they found out only when she fled for a divorce from Richard's father, charging Leroy Buck with extreme and repeated cruelty and enumerating various incidents of physical abuse. Leroy countered in court that Gertrude had been faithless and added that he was a veteran. Gertrude returned with Leroy was no longer in the military. In fact, he had received a Section 8 discharge. In a decision that had great repercussions, the judge sided with Leroy, proclaiming that Gertrude was an unfit person to have custody of Richard. He awarded full custody to Richard's father, giving Gertrude no right to visit her son without the approval of his father. It was a curiously extreme decision, one that sent Richard back to Peoria brothel bound. Swing into action. Under the direction of Juliet Whitaker, 8 singing groups, including the Silicones, along with a band and a dance group, took to the stage for the Carver Center's talent show, Broadway Best. Pryor often hosted Miss Whitaker's talent show and may have even acted as the MC for Broadway's Best. Richard's love for performance. Matt Clark, a childhood friend of Richard Pryor, recalled the comics beginning in the 2005 Peoria Journal Star piece published after Pryor's death. Clark knew a lonely Pryor, a boy who, as an only child growing up in a brothel, was surrounded by adult dealings and hankered to join the playtime of his large set of brothers and sisters. Richard's battle-up imagination made him, as Clark notes, a prime target for Juliet Whitaker's mentorship. Clark remembers a boy who, armed with Whitaker's confidence and an unshakable work ethic, performed for anyone who would listen. Even it meant performing on the street before an audience that was sometimes indifferent or hostile. Richard's first debut. In an article celebrating Richard Pryor's national TV debut in 1964, Juliet Whitaker of Carver Center is name-checked for urging Pryor to move into any and every stage he could find. Peorian Richard Pryor will make his national television debut Wednesday at 9 p.m. on WMBD-TV in the show On Broadway Tonight. The show, emceed by Rudy Valley, brings top talent before a national television audience. Participants normally are chosen from nightclubs or coffeehouse circuits. Pryor, 23, was influenced by Juliet Whitaker of Carver Center to move into any stage he could find. After a 2-year hitch in the Army, he got his first job in New York at the Cafe where he spent a year. He then moved uptown where he appeared at a living room with Denise Darcel. He also worked with Gloria Lynn at the Uptown Theater in Philadelphia. The Walter End in the Cafe El Go-Go and the Champagne Gallery in New York. He is a comic singer, dancer, impressionist, and pantomimist. He was born in Peoria shortly after his father, Leroy. Richard visited his mother. He cracks a joke. Richard had not had much contact with his mother since the 1940s, so this bedside visit may have been highly charged in the 23 years since her divorce from Richard's father. Gertrude had married a man by the last name of Emmanuel, though she was no longer with him, had filled out in weight and lost several of her teeth, and had contacted or contracted a cancer that was sapping her strength. After her ex-husband Buck's death in 1968, Gertrude had re-entered the Pryor family circle, living at 1319 Millman with her former mother-in-law Mary and three other members of the Pryor family. No more than 50, she had been ravaged by the time, and her cancer still in advance of her son's visit. She applied her makeup and put herself together as if it were Sunday. In this photograph, taken by a Peoria Journal star photographer, though it never appeared in the newspaper, Richard looks at Gertrude warmly and appears to have just cracked a joke. Her eyes are crinkling at the edges, her mouth with laughter. Richard's grandmother's death. After 79 tumultuous years, Mary Carter Pryor Bryant passed away at the Methodist Medical Center in Peoria, Illinois, following one funeral at Morning Star Baptist Church in Peoria and another at the Church of Living God in Decatur, Illinois. She was finally laid to rest in Greenwood Cemetery in Decatur. Richard Pryor joins grieving family for grandmother's funeral. He just stood there shaking like a rag doll. He was just crying and talking, "Mama, mama, mama." He had a grip on her hand, and they four persons couldn't pry him loose without a struggle. They couldn't get him out of that hospital room, and when they did, he broke and come right back in there. With tears in her eyes, Miss Machin Pryor described the final moments her famous nephew Richard Pryor spent with his 79-year-old grandmother, Miss Mary Carter Pryor Bryant, who died in Methodist Medical Center in Peoria, Illinois. It was 6:30 in the morning, Miss Pryor recalled, and when the wagon table came to take Mama to the morgue, they had to pull Richard out of here, she continued. Richard's beginning. Who believed in you? Who cared for you? Asked TV interviewer Barbara Walters in 1979, probing comedian Richard Pryor about his childhood. Pryor's response was heartbreakingly evocative. Richard Franklin Lennox Thomas Pryor III and Magic Dust. Growing up in Peoria's red light district, the young Richard felt radically alone, with nothing to rely upon but himself and what his imagination could conjure. He learned much from his grandmother Mary, who took care of him in her fashion, but it was his imagination, the magic dust, that became his constant companion, and it was his imagination that propelled him to the stage. The cradle of North Washington Street, 1940-1945. Richard Pryor was born December 1st, 1940 in Peoria St. Francis Hospital to Leroy Buck Pryor and Gertrude Thomas. There was no birth announcement in the local newspaper because Pryor parents were unmarried and the papers did not triumph births that could be or not be attached to a Mr. and Mrs. He grew up at first in a brothel run by his grandmother Mary, in which his father worked as a pimp and his mother as a prostitute. Early childhood. Pryor was raised in his grandmother's brothel on this unassuming block in the heart of Peoria's red light district. Many of his neighbors were like his father and grandmother, the proprietors of brothels. With the exception of the Italian-American Joe Eagle, they were also black. The photograph was taken in 1938 by Ernest Grassel, a Peorian who accumulated over some 5 decades 82 volumes of street photographs of Peoria. The name of the owner reflects those who lived on the block with Pryor's family in the mid to late 1940s. Richard's parents' marriage. Richard's parents, Leroy Buck Pryor and Gertrude Thomas, were married on Christmas Eve in 1943, 1 week before Buck was due to report for the Army. Richard was already 3 years old. Such marriages were common in the immediate run-up to military service. Without the marriage, Richard's mother would not have been able for the $70 monthly allotment that the federal government dispersed to military wives and would not have been eligible for widow's benefits if Richard's father had been killed in war. The circumstances of Leroy and Gertrude relationship. Richard's parents, Leroy Buck Pryor and Gertrude Thomas, were married on Christmas Eve in 1943, 1 week before Buck was due to report for the Army. Richard was already 3 years old. Such marriages were common in the immediate run-up to the military. Without the marriage, Richard's mother would not have been eligible for the $70 monthly allotment that the federal government dispersed to military wives. They would not have been eligible for widow's benefits if Richard's father had been killed in the war. Richard was born out of wedlock. The Pryor family. The photograph is perhaps the only surviving photograph that places Richard's father Buck and his mother Gertrude in the same frame. It dates from the short window in their lives when they worked together at the famous door, the Pryor Family Tavern. The tavern opened on North Adams Street around 1945. By the end of December 1945, Gertrude had left Buck and the Pryor family and taken her 5-year-old son Richard with her. Top row, unidentified woman, unidentified man, Mary Pryor, Richard Dickey Carter, Leroy Buck Pryor, bottom row, Pryor, D. Pryor. Margaret Yingst Parker and Richard Pryor had this deal which they never forgot. It was such a big deal that Miss Parker would be moved to say 30 years later, Richard came through for me. Then she was sad proud that Richard came through for her long before he came through for Ed Sullivan or Johnny Carson. Though Mr. Pryor mentioned her 2 weeks ago on nationwide TV, Miss Parker has neither seen nor talked to Mr. Pryor in ages. That helps to explain why, when the comedian caught fire and nearly died 2 years ago, Miss Parker felt like shaking her finger and saying, "Oh, the little Dickens." It breaks It fakes a certain type of person to think of a 41-year-old Hollywood star as Little Dickens. I don't think of Richard as an adult, says Miss Parker. I guess I don't think of him as being grown. 1952 and 3 was the school year when Miss Parker, now a retired Peoria school teacher, and Richard's now a retired sixth grader, made the deal that would lead Richard to reflect decades later. The only time I would express myself was when I was being funny. So my teacher made a deal with me. The deal was made because morning roll call during the first few months at Blaine Summer Grade School in 1952 went something like this: Richard Pryor, Richard. Nobody usually answered. The nobody who one day would be a somebody was sound asleep on a city bus rolling down Adams Street. He'd missed the stop all right. Half an hour after the morning bell, Richard would ambling in the classroom and plop himself down at a desk in the first row. He looked like he'd been up half the night, which Miss Parker speculates he had. Richard, she would say, you leave home early enough to get to school on time. Just why does this tardiness continue day after day? Richard would fold his hands on his desk and yarn. Well, you see, Miss Hinks, it's like this. Yawn, I get on the bus, the ride makes me yawn, so sleepy that. Margaret became his confidant, listening as Richard expressed the frustration and fears that attended his isolation. The two would often walk home together after school, a sign of their affection for each other. Margaret is Richard's classmate, and this is just his classmate telling about Richard Pryor and how he went through a lot of things. Harold's Club. Richard Pryor held down his first paying job as a professional comedian at Harold's Club, a nightclub that was a mere 2 blocks from where Pryor grew up. As this photograph suggests, the ambience of Harold's Club radiated out from its owner and namesake, Harold Parker, who also used photographs of himself to decorate his bar. From the pattern parquet floor and the spray of flowers atop the piano to the signs advertising the men's lounge and powder room, Harold's Club aspired to a certain level of swankiness. Its package entertainments featured tuxedoed musicians and costume choir girls. At the same time, the testimony of musicians who played there suggests another side to the Harold's Club, one undocumented in the photo. The exuberance of its crowds. The club attracted a mixed crowd of young and old, gay and straight and black and white, and there was a great deal of dynamic energy unlocked by that. Father of five shotgunned. Though he goes unmentioned in this Peoria Journal Star article, Richard Pryor and a musician friend from Harold's Club were at the Elks Club of Black Fraternal Society on the night of this murder. They were about to leave through the front door when the bouncer, James King, advised them to stay back. There was a man, Albert Good Kid Charles, outside the door with a shotgun, and he meant trouble. King himself went out the door, and while attempting to disarm Charles, was shot point blank in the groin. He died on the steps of the club asking, "Good Kid, why did you shoot me?" The shooting was a tragedy for the family of King, a father of five and a leader in a local church, and a near miss for young Richard. It also revealed the dark side of Rowan, Peoria, where personal grievances were not infrequently settled through force. Grand jury recommendation on the fatal shooting. A coroner's jury heard from witnesses to the shooting of James King, a bouncer at Elks Club, by Albert Goodkid Charles. Palmer Evans, a close friend of King, recalled the sequence of events that had led to the shooting. Charles' earlier dispute at the club with an unidentified man, King's attempt to dissuade Charles from entering the club to settle accounts, and Charles' hostility replied, "What's it to you?" Richard Pryor had narrowly escaped himself being a witness to the shooting. He was about to leave the Elks Club that night when King advised him that he should avoid the door as a man with a shotgun was approaching it. The Pursuit of Freedom mural. The mural was painted as a tri-lynch, and each of its three panels pulled the viewer in a different direction. On the right, a group of black leaders strode forward with dignity and assurance. The Statue of Liberty blessed their processions from behind. The figures were all male, but offered a range of black achievement in the fields of science. George Washington Carver, Law Ralford Bunchy, Community Service Carver, Founder Emmett at Will, Sports Jackie Robinson, and the military Colonel Benjamin Davis, Shivers on, Commander in World War II. If the right side of the mural offered a set of heroes worthy of emulation, the left side of the mural depicts the long journey to heroism. Two pigtail black girls joined a multiracial crowd posed at the bottom of a seemingly endless staircase heading to a beautiful city in the clouds. In the center of the mural, Shivers underline the difficulties behind the work of uplift. In the foreground, a working class man in jeans and a white-haired black woman pulled on a rope that trailed down to a set of hands, which appeared to be holding on for dear life. The man in jeans bore a striking resemblance to Shivers himself, suggesting the depth of Shivers' own commitment to the project of uplift. Meanwhile, in the background, Shivers added his most caustic element, one that none of Peoria's newspapers noted in their coverage of the mural. A white judge, no Ralph Bunchy, was slumped at his bench as if he'd been murdered or was taking a very long nap. A vacant jail cell beckoned next to him. A wash of storm clouds hovered in the distance. There was a big gap, it seemed, between the promise of the Statue of Liberty and the reality of justice in America. In all, the composition of the mural suggests that young blacks would have to take a difficult loop route to success. They would need to climb the first staircase in the lower right, then the long second staircase in the upper left. Only then would they leap over the sleeping judge and jail cell in the middle and join the procession of heroes on the right. The pursuit of freedom was the work of a lifetime.